Well, I'm here with Aldon Nielsen. Aldon, good to see you.
Good to see
Thanks
you. Good to
so
see
much.
anybody again.
Yeah, really. It's great. It's great that we're having this conversation. We're going to be talking about two poems by Amiri Baraka. Both were collected in a book called Black Magic.
Correct.
Would you hold that up so people can see it?
Well, yeah, I wasn't going to tell the story about the cover till later, but you'll notice it still says Leroy Jones because he hadn't changed his name yet when he wrote most of what's in this
67.
book. Yeah. Now, one of the first books I ever bought with my own cash was Dead Lecture, and so when this came out, I could tell from the cover that it wasn't really for me. What I didn't know as a teenager picking this book up is this cover was designed by white people.
Is that right? At
Yeah.
what press?
Bob Zamero, who published
Bob
quite a bit of his
Zamero,
work, yeah.
Cincinnati.
But, Quentin Fiore was one of the book designers who did a lot of work with Marshall McLuhan and so forth, and Lawrence Ratskin actually did that. And now how many people looking at that would have guessed
It's
that this,
weird.
that this
weird.
extreme nationalist volume was designed by these two white guys?
Well, we're talking about two poems from the book. One
Right.
is more or less contemporary with the gathering of this book, 61 poems 61 to 67, and that's called Return of the Native. And the
Correct.
other is Tone Poem, which is earlier. We're going to start with Return of the Native. And I just want to start by, I'm going to read the first 5 lines and just ask you to help us understand the relationship between Harlem and modernism.
Well, particularly
here.
because the first sentence is one of the most frequently quoted Baraka lines.
Is that right?
Yeah. Although very few people quote much from the rest of
Baraka
the
period. Okay. Return to the Native. Okay, so the first 5 lines are: Harlem is vicious modernism, bang clash. Vicious the way it's made. Can you stand such beauty? So violent and transforming. I guess we want to start with what is the relationship between Harlem and modernism.
Well, there's the historical relationship. When Baraka used to talk about New York history, he reminded people, I noticed several senators don't seem to be aware of this, that Harlem had not been a black community all that long when the Harlem Renaissance happens. Prior to that, there had been other primarily black communities, Hell's Kitchen being one of them.
Right.
So it's, Harlem, as the largest black community outside of Africa in the world, is a product of the Great Migration, as so many millions of people were leaving the rural South, moving to the urban North, Midwest, and West. And this is absolutely, the Harlem Renaissance, nobody argues that that's not part of modernism. But, it's a modernism that comes about because of certain social factors and historical factors and pressures that created this community in the certain way it existed. And, of course, by the time Baraka moves there, this poem is a product of the time he moves from the village up to Harlem. And by the time he moves there...
So this is early 60s, you
No,
mentioned?
mid-60s.
Mid-60s.
Yeah, after Malcolm X is assassinated, which is 1965. And, so the Harlem of that day is not quite the Harlem of the Harlem Renaissance anymore, but it's still an enormous black community, both containing the beauties of black culture that had been forced to survive in environments that were hostile to it, and the complexities and difficulties of all, poverty next to riches in the same neighborhood and so forth. Yeah.
So, whereas in the 20s, white modernists and others who are interested in the new arts, roughly speaking, would visit Harlem and have relationships with black artists in Harlem, and so Harlem and modernism would be a positive connection for the most part.
Well, yeah, for the most part. As it happens, one of the early photographs of Baraka that was used by his publishers was taken by Carl Van Vechten.
Exactly.
Who, in addition to being the author of N-Word Heaven and the sponsor of so many black poets,
Photographed
was
many
a great
black
photographer.
artists.
Yeah. But it's also, this poem has an odd correlation, an odd connection to Baraka and postmodernism. I've argued in many places, following arguments that C.L.R. James and Du Bois made back in the 1930s, that we have to understand the black diaspora as progenitors of modernity, not just subjects of it or subjects to it and so forth. And in order for those people to have made that argument, modernism, as it were, had to be on the table already. So you're kind of in a post position when you're discussing modernity and modernism in that way, even before we get to, say, Olson's version of the postmodern. Now, I'm one of those people who would say Baraka is a classic example of kind of an Olsonian postmodern. But in his own later writings, he's hearing various condemnations of the postmodern. He's not like sitting around reading Leotard and so forth. So he actually writes some very negative things about the term postmodern.
Right.
Which
Right.
in a way kind of means you have to be postmodern to be able to do that. But to me, this clearly is a postmodern poem because it's a reopening
Right.
of black modernism
Right.
as he's moving into this new phase.
So declaring, startlingly,
Yeah.
that Harlem is vicious modernism, which is a very interesting way of saying that modernism is vicious. It's not the same.
Vicious the way it's made.
The
as
way
you
it's
read it.
made.
Yeah.
So it's made, of course, it's does not have the possessive there, so it's a bit complicated, but let's just assume the possessive should be there. Vicious the way it's made. So it's a contention about the way modern art is made.
Mm-hmm.
And what does that have to do with Harlem, or what might it have to do with Harlem?
Well, Harlem is a result of segregation. Harlem is a result of oppression. Harlem is the thing that most people, to this day, there's people arguing about the term Harlem Renaissance. Some people prefer the term Negro Renaissance. Some people don't like the term Renaissance at all. But whatever way we're looking at it, that incredible efflorescence of
Right.
productivity and
Right.
art is at least partly in response to some of the most vicious things in American history. As to the apostrophe being there or not being there, as with Williams, we can never be sure what Baraka's own intention may or may not have been at one time or another.
Right. So,
This book, by the way, doesn't even have a table of contents.
so you just have to find the poem.
Exactly, yeah.
So let's look back at the title.
Mm-hmm.
Let's get that in there. I read the poem a bunch of times, and I keep returning to the idea, as it were, that the speaker, or Baraka, wants to figure himself as someone going back to Harlem with a new view of it. And Return of the Native, he's not native to Harlem,
No.
but still, Return of the Native, aside from it being the title of a Thomas Hardy novel,
Well, I'm glad you mentioned that because, again, this is one of the poems that's most intimately linked with his move to cultural nationalism. And yet it's
Yeah.
sitting here under the title of this famous book by a white British author.
Yeah.
We can just point at the irony and wonder about it. As to the nativity, on the one hand, he doesn't necessarily mean that he's a native of Harlem so much as he means that he's a native of Black America and so forth.
So returning,
Yeah.
the return of Baraka at this critical moment in his career to Harlem, let's just say after modernism. Is that where we are so far?
And to the extent that there is an after, but
Yeah.
this is a theme that's very common in Black poetry of the time period. You read lines, I think it's Hakeem Madhubuti who writes Back Again, Black Again, Home, because it was also a return to blackness for Baraka and Madhubuti, Nikki Giovanni, and so many others.
Right. That makes sense. When you get to the second stanza, it becomes unironic and sincere, it seems to me. The place and placement of black people, etc. And then further down, can you sing yourself, your life, your place? So am I wrong in reading this as a positive claim or aspiration of aesthetic independence and freedom associated with Harlem as a place?
Well, it's absolutely positive. It's not entirely unironic. This stuff about Egypt being a weird word, for example.
I skipped that.
But no, again, again, I'm one of those people who's asserted that through all his ideological changes, Baraka's approach to writing itself hasn't really changed all that much. But he was constantly thinking about it as a need to change. So, for example, in response to a question I asked him and many other people have asked him, when you talk about his first novel, The System of Dante's Hell, he will tell you that he was in some ways trying to write his way out of being too influenced by Olson and Creeley. Now, to me, when he comes out on the other side with books like this, you can still see that new American aesthetic, projective
and the idea of the place
very much there. But by the same token, that idea of being able to sing blackness, being able to sing black culture, can you do that as opposed to aspiring to acceptance from a white poetic community and so forth and so on. Very, very, very much positive. Now, the Harlem period only lasts a few years for him because of internal dissensions, partly at least, that we can lay at the foot of COINTELPRO and other organizations.
But then he does go back to Newark. At this point, he didn't know that was going to collapse.
Oh, no. But he knew a few things.
Yeah.
But
so can you sing yourself, your life, your place? The answer is hopefully the answer is hopeful, and the answer is yes. He wants it to be yes. Yes?
Yes, each thing, life we have or love is meant for us in a world like this.
And this is Harlem.
Yeah. Well, and what Harlem stands for.
Right.
Not just the geographical place.
Where we may see ourselves all the time.
Exactly. And suffer and joy that our lives are so familiar. Again, he had this, this is why it's a return. Because, of course, he grows up as a black person in Newark, New Jersey. Admittedly, well, I don't know why I said admittedly, in integrated schools. He's in these ethnic neighborhoods. He knows a lot of Italian kids and Jewish kids and so forth and so on.
Yeah.
But, he'd been living in Bohemian Greenwich Village, working with a lot of white artists, very close friends with everyone in the New York School, the Beat School, and so forth and so on, the Black Mountain School. He talks about the Black Mountain set that hung around his crib in the autobiography, for example. So it's a return and a reclamation of the contours of the black intellectual and artistic life that he felt that he'd drifted away from over time. So it's a return politically to organizing black lives. It's a return culturally to living among black people in a black community, and a return in his mind to a certain kind of writing that would be, well, this is around the time people start talking about a black aesthetic, for example. Yeah.
So when he says their mind's mine, the black hope mine, he is repossessing. He's going back to Harlem. I'm kind of repeating the reading of this, but I want to make sure we get it right. He's going back to Harlem with a new view of it and wanting to create an aesthetic that is Harlem-based, or that is Harlem-ish.
Or just black.
Black.
Yeah, just read Harlem as being black.
Black hope mine. So this second stanza, aside from that quip about Egypt, is sincere, it's lyric, it's straightforward, and it's very beautiful, and suffer and joy.
And again, I always have to be careful about Baraka's typography, but you'll notice time is capitalized.
Yeah.
I've never been entirely sure what to make of that, except that it's clearly some kind of long-range view.
And also a bit of a rhyme.
Well, and a pun, it means in time, meaning the long stream of history and so forth, but also means getting there in time before it was too late.
Yeah.
Gene Toomer's great poem, is it Song of the Sun, where he's reaching for that last piece of fruit that the song-lit race of slaves left for him, so that he can somehow carry this forward into the modern.
The sky sits awake over us, screaming at us, no rain, sun, hot cleaning sun, drives us under it. Let's turn to the other poem, tone poem. This is complicated. So it's for Elvin Jones,
and
member of Coltrane's quartet, and the black figurative painter Bob Thompson. So we've got a sound person and a color person.
And most people know Elvin Jones because he was part of the classic Coltrane Quartet. There's kind of a revival of interest in Bob Thompson going on. There have been several gallery shows recently.
Yeah.
But he's the person that most people don't know in this dedication. And of course, he was a tremendous painter. He's one of those people Baraka meets during his village time, along with Tom Postel and others, and Elvin Jones. Jones and Thompson and Baraka were all fast friends in the early part of the 60s. This is from the part of Black Magic that is called Sabotage, and includes the poems 1961 and 1963. This is literally 3 books in one book. And those are the poems directly after Dead Lecture. Some of them even overlap with Dead Lecture. But Thompson is an incredibly important figure for Baraka, but one that he only seems to write about, other than his autobiography, during the peak of his cultural nationalist period. So, for example, Thompson comes up in a later poem titled, not that one, I've lost my little marker here, but he comes up in a later poem in this volume that's written at the height of Baraka's cultural nationalist period, and is also the peak of Baraka's anti-Semitism, misogyny, homophobia, and so forth. I'm not putting my hands on that one right away. But he also comes up in the archives. There's a manuscript of a draft by Baraka, still writing as Leroy Jones, titled A Poem to be Read for Bob Thompson's Funeral. Nice. I'm pretty sure it wasn't. Okay. and again, the worst kind of anti-Semitism and so forth,
So why does Thompson appear here? I mean, my rather abstract reading of this, maybe too abstract, is tone means sound, like the tone of that instrument that you've just played, although Jones is a drummer, so we're not getting...
Painters speak of tonality also.
And painters.
Yeah.
So one is sound, the other is color or tone, right, pigment.
And also
you've got Thompson, who's a figurative painter.
And it's a tribute to their really tight friendship, although part of that tight friendship was apparently wandering around looking for drugs, which is what kills Bob Thompson in the end.
Is that right?
Yeah.
So I was starting to say my abstract reading of this poem, at least for starters, is that it is an experiment in trying to understand tone as not just the literary definition of tone, which is the attitude toward the subject as evidenced by word choice, but it is experimenting with the other arts, sound and color, music and painting.
Or at least responding to them.
Or responding to it. So how does it respond to that?
Well, again, in this collection, which does not appear, there's a poem that does not appear in SOS called Tone Row.
SOS is, Aldon just referred to SOS,
Yeah.
which is the not quite sort of an A minus collected.
Yeah.
We shouldn't say that. I mean, it is the way to go.
Well,
to
it's a
get many of the
problematic
poems.
text. There's still some mistakes in it.
Yeah.
What happened was Grove Press took the earlier selected transblusancy and then kept adding to it. There's very little poetry in this book from this time period that we're talking about.
Why?
Well, again,
People are
you have
trying
to ask the editor about that.
Well, but are they trying to avoid the hardest politics?
That would be my assumption, but again, I
Yeah.
have not spoken to the editor probably in 15 years, so I can't really say. And I don't know how much is the editor, how much was Grove Press, but for whatever reason, there is less poetry from the cultural nationalist period than that. Now, admittedly, that was one of the shorter periods of his ideological development, only lasts about 6 years.
And Return to the Native is one of those, but it happens to be in...
Yeah. But for example, I was going to add, the paperback does something interesting. There's an edition at the end of the book that Harmony Holiday does that's labeled, that's described as transcriptions. And a couple of those, for example, the poem Nation Time is represented, but it's not the whole poem, even though that entire poem was available. I think what we have in SOS to represent that poem is in fact a transcription of the portion of the reading of it that you see in one documentary about Baraka from the time period.
Wow. Okay.
So,
right.
Even with the additional poems that have been added to the later printings of the book, we still only have very little from that time period. Now, a joke I maybe shouldn't tell, after Transblusancy was published, edited by the same person, there was a 61st birthday tribute for Baraka at the Schomburg. Originally planned for his 60th, but we didn't have the money to, well, not me, they didn't have the money to do it, so it wound up being for his 61st birthday.
Okay.
And Kalamu Ya Salam, one of the organizers, walks up to Amiri as things are going, because we'd all just gotten Transblusancy, right? And he starts asking, why isn't this poem in it? Why isn't this poem in it? And Baraka just smiled and said, the editor didn't want people to think I'm a racist.
Wow.
Now, I don't know if that represents any actual conversation they had or not, but it's what Baraka joked about at the time.
So Tone Poem fits in this narrative as an earlier poem collected in Black Magic.
Yeah, before
not subject to the exclusions of this.
Well, and he hasn't become a cultural nationalist yet when he writes.
Right.
Because these, as I said, 61 to 63, the cultural nationalism really starts around 60. I mean, it's developing over time, but it's 65 to about 72.
So help us understand, for instance, in that context, help us understand a line like about 2/3 of the way down the first page. Read this line, young colored or white, and know I felt the twist of dividing memory.
Well, again,
Who's being addressed? Is that us?
Well, yeah, readers are being addressed.
Read this line.
Yeah, a direct address to the reader, as we learned to say in our English classes when we were undergraduates. But again, on the one hand, it's a tremendous tribute to this early friendship of these incredible artists.
You mean Jones and Thompson?
Yeah, and Baraka. Again, they were sort of a trio. And as I was starting to say earlier, Thompson becomes very important for Baraka in different ways. There's also a poem in Black Magic called Babylon Revisited, and I'm not going to read it because there's so much vileness in it. But as he does also in the case of Tom Postel, he comes to see Bob Thompson's fate as something that's a product of the viciousness of white civilization in many ways, and racism. In his autobiography, he recollects Thompson, crying at the assassination of John Kennedy. It's a really emotional moment. And then he thinks about what happens to Thompson later. I think he dies when he's just 29 or something like that. And similarly, the poet Tom Postel, who went a little nuts, and here's an irony for you. Baraka, in the autobiography, remembers running into Postel, sort of wandering the streets, blaming the Jews for everything, which, of course, is what Baraka starts to do in poems right after that.
Right.
But the music connection, too, there's also a poem in here, and people don't realize just how broad Baraka's listening was. There's a poem here called Tone Row.
Tone
row, which of course is the term that serial composition uses, not the Olsonian serial composition, but the kind we talk about in music, where instead of using one of the two scales we're familiar with in modern Western music, major and minor, you select a row of 12 notes and put them through a series of transmutations. This is associated with people like Schomburg and Weber and so on. And Baraka was listening to all that. He was listening to Stockhausen. He was, knew John Cage and all that. So he's thinking of, in the same way that so many of them thought of a relationship between open field poetics and sort of the open field abstract expressionist painting.
Yeah.
He's thinking, because he's much more into music even than painting. By the way, Bob Thompson painted a picture of Baraka's family. I think it's just titled Leroy Jones and His Family. It's Leroy and Hetty and the two little girls. Mm. But Baraka thinks very much of composition in poetry along those same kinds of lines, although he's not going to become a Taggart and do that kind, or an Ensslin and do that kind of endless transmutation of the same small number of words to see what you could have. Right. But he's got that in his mind as he's writing these kinds of things. Now, what makes this poetry so confusing to a lot of people is that it very much is that, I can't remember the exact words Olson uses in Projective Verse, but that conception, one perception must follow, I think he says instanter or something weird like that, upon another. Yeah. Now, that makes it hard for a lot of people who aren't used to reading an Olson or a Creeley or a Baraka to know what to make when you have these tremendous jumps, not only from sentence to sentence, but phrase to phrase.
Can you find one in here in tone poem?
Well,
they're all over the place.
Yeah. As history in a cloud, their faces bang invisible notes, wind scribbled leaves and foam, an eagle hangs above them spinning, years and travelers linger among the dead, and so forth. The general good suddenly makes an appearance. The general good has no troops or armor. I think we could probably all agree with that, especially in these days. Subtly, the books stand closed. I think as in closing the books, like when you close out a business or something like that.
The books are closed, meaning we've finished our accounting.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. Except sad facts circled for unknown hippies. Carrying the mail.
Hippies carrying the mail.
Now,
referred to in the early 60s.
This is before 63. The word was around already.
Yeah, but this is fairly unusual.
Yeah. So clearly he doesn't mean the hippies of San Francisco from just 2
later
years
period,
later.
Yeah.
But what's something else that Charles Olson and Leroy Jones have in common? They're the sons of mailmen.
They are, right. That's right. Oh, that's so interesting.
Yeah.
So, but what you just read is a tone poem, is that serial stuff you were just talking about.
Yeah. Well,
quite brilliant.
At the end, I'm here now, Leroy.
Addressing himself, his earlier self. Well, he's still Leroy.
He's still talking to us, too.
Yeah.
I'm here now, Leroy. He does this all the time in his poetry. That line, I wonder when they say Roy is dead, who will they mean?
Yeah.
I'm here now, Leroy, who tried to say something long before you. Now, the you is clearly us. Keep it. Forget me or what I say, and here's the key to what you were asking about. But not the tone, and then this puzzling last part, and exit image.
All right, we need to close read that. I'm here now, Leroy. I, the speaker, am talking to myself. Yeah.
Or I am Leroy and I'm talking to you. It works either way. It appears as a positive.
I'm here now. I.e. Leroy.
Yeah.
Who tried to say something long meaning I've been working at this for a while, or this poem is long?
A longish poem, or something that will last.
Okay.
Yeah.
I want to say something that will last for you. I want
to keep in mind the whole time that it's both the appositive that he's talking to himself and identifying himself speaking to us.
Okay.
Yeah. So that means the you is both him and us.
Which is confusing.
Yeah.
Keep it. The thing that I wrote for you, keep it. Mm-hmm. So that's a standard poetic move. Mm-hmm. And then forget me. So keep it.
Or what I say.
Forget me. forget me. Well, if forget what I say, then we got a problem with keeping it because we're supposed to keep the poem. But forget me. I mean, Ashbery makes this distinction all the time. Don't be interested in me. Be interested in the poem that I just wrote. Forget me or what I say, but not the tone. Okay, explain that. That's great. That's actually quite great.
Well, again, on the one hand, it's the tone of what's the word I'm looking for when you have a poem for a person who's deceased.
An elegy.
Yeah, it's the elegiac tone, because he's also already at this time period. He's also realizing that he's in a way. He isn't saying goodbye to his name yet, although we have to keep in mind he's not born Leroy Jones. He's born Leroy Jones, and he becomes Leroy when he's attending Howard.
It's a little more pretentious.
Yeah, so it's this succession of names. Just as when he changes to Baraka, it's initially Amamu Amiri Baraka, and then of course when he becomes a Marxist, he drops the Amamu.
Right.
But I think already in these poems he recognizes that the Leroy Jones that we know from preface to 20-volume Suicide Note, although again, he wrote more than 20 volumes and never finished the Suicide Note, but he knows that he's going to be leaving that behind. Now again, any young person might write something like that. I'm sure all of us who write poetry have had that kind of a sensibility. But he's also, even though this is a couple years before he makes the move to Harlem, he's already in some ways recognizing that the kind of life he was living in those village days is something that already is slipping into the past.
As early as 61, 62. So that's the exit image. The image that I've had as I leave the stage, as I leave the scene.
Yeah. Possibly.
Would you read the end of the poem starting with no points?
No points or theories from now on, just me and mine. When they get me, just think of me as typing with a drink at my right hand, some women who love me, and the day growing old and sloppy through the window.
There's a little bit of beat poetry at the very end, very Kerouacian.
Yeah.
He's being pretentious in saying, I'm not a theoretical person, I'm not an ideological person, I'm just writing.
Or at least setting that as a goal from now on.
From now on, right?
Yeah.
And that's alluring, except we know that it's not quite true.
Well, it's also not quite possible, but it's pointing in the direction. The one poem that probably gets quoted and anthologized most from the Black Arts period is Black Art. Poems are bullshit, unless, right? And everyone always reads that correctly as Baraka's desire for a more direct, more material thing having to do with language, a desire that goes back to Emerson and the Romanticists. Where Emerson was always wanting. Emerson had this idea that indigenous people's languages were just nouns, which is complete BS itself. But of course, even in Black Art, okay, lemons, but then you get this thing about nickel hearts. That's as abstract as Emily Dickinson's Zero at the Bone. So on the one hand, going into the Black Arts period, he wants increasingly a language that acts in the world and has material consequences and is itself material, which of course is an idea going back to modernist breakthroughs. But there's still the inevitable abstraction, with something like men leaving women nickel hearts. What is that?
Yeah. Let me ask you this. What would Baraka? This is a ridiculous question. You're the one person.
You see my bracelet
that
that says, "What would Baraka say?"
Well, that's actually what I'm going to ask you, and it's unfair. But you're the one person I know could answer this question. What would the Baraka of '67 say to the Baraka who wrote Tone Poem?
Well, he would probably accuse him of unnecessary abstraction. I'm willing to bet, and he would probably associate that with whiteness. Now, it's interesting you say 67.
So he would reverse no points or theories. Yes points and yes theories. Becoming more of an ideological person.
He didn't see that. Well, again, all through the Black Arts period, he's, like a lot of other people, Larry Neal and others, is talking about aesthetics and wanting to have an aesthetic and so forth and so on. But he sees that as more, during that time period, as more directly material and connected to the daily lives of human beings. And he would have thought that this earlier version of himself wasn't enough in that direction. Now, it's the fact that he's asking about the Baraka of '67 is interesting because by '72, he's a Marxist, and he's completely rejected all of that. He becomes the most fervent anti-Semitism poet that I've ever met. in the sense that he would openly attack people who were doing what he had just been doing a few years before.
Right.
And of course, he becomes someone who's a deep reader of Marxist theory and so forth. But he would still probably present that as somehow being more concrete than his earlier self had been.
So I should have asked, what would the 72 Baraka say to the 67 Baraka about the Leroy Jones tone poem? Because there's clearly a series of transitions. And I actually, Aldon, I think that I'm going to overread this one line in tone poem, but I see him reflecting on the stages, kind of telescoping and in advance. Got drunk, then high, then sick, then quiet.
That's also a literal description of what these three guys would do. I'm serious.
So it's both an evening with Jones and Thompson and also a kind of a preface to the way that the phases would occur. Yeah. All right, I want to ask you...
You might think of that early beat area, I guess, is the drunk area.
That's the drunk. And then high is the early 60s. Then sick at heart, I would say. But never quiet, so that doesn't work.
There's certainly a great deal of sickness of the heart that pushes him out of the village and to Harlem. The most dramatic moment is when he's at a bookstore reading with some friends and Hetty, and the news comes of Malcolm X having been killed. And it takes quite a while for him to make the transition. As you read in his autobiography, he keeps going back home to Hetty and the girls when he's supposedly already made this break. But, that's the moment when he really feels like, I just cannot be in this society anymore. And for the white writers and artists of the village, it seemed that abrupt. David Anton used to talk as if Baraka had just sort of been assumed out of there and plopped down somewhere else. Ginsberg stayed friends with him, though, even at times when Baraka was writing some pretty horrible things about Ginsberg. So, yes, black nationalism exists, but it's hard to be a real separatist in the United States.
This poem, tone poem, with its beat ending, creates a kind of self-empathy. It creates a kind of maudlin view about the situation of the artist before he figures things out, and I really like that ending. I really think, even though it is derivative, it's derivative of Kerouac or somebody, especially Through the Window. That's a Kerouacian disposition.
Again, it's hard. When we're talking about these two guys, it's hard to talk about something being derivative because they've been so tight for so long. That window stuff is all through Baraka. From the very first book to the very last book.
Okay.
And, they published each other. Kerouac was published by Baraka. They went to the same parties. They knew all the same people. Now, clearly, the early Kerouac is not so much of an influence on Baraka.
Yeah, I'm not thinking about that. I'm thinking of the Kerouac whose day grows old and sloppy. And of course, it's Kerouac drinking who grows sloppy, but sits at the window and gathers the sounds of the city in the best Kerouac poetry that happens to be heard from the street.
To me, it's not so much derivative as they're both doing the same thing.
Yeah.
Now, again, Baraka's at the very center, as we alluded to earlier, of all those new American poetics movements that are happening at that time. He's one of the few people who's actually connected with all of them.
Yeah.
We all know about his deep friendship with Frank O'Hara, for example, who he always pronounced it Frank O'Hara. I'm not sure. Maybe that was the correct way. How would I know? And of course, Olson was a tremendous influence. That in Baraka's papers at Howard, there's this little slip of paper in an envelope from a time when he went up to Gloucester, along with, I'm forgetting names again. Who's the not Gary Snyder, but beat poet in the San Francisco area who actually became a Zen monk.
Philip Whalen?
Yeah, Philip Whalen is on that trip, if I remember right. And there's a third person. And they all each wrote a little piece of verse on this piece of paper and stuck in this envelope that's still sitting in this box decades later. So he was unusual, partly because of his efforts as a publisher-editor through Eugen and Floating Bear and Totem Corinth Press and all these other things. But he was not the person who was making peace among all these different groups, but he was with all of them. And leaves all of them behind just a few years later.
We're going to wrap up, but I want to know I would love your general impressions. We picked two poems. I picked them, and you
picked
said
them.
okay. But what
I said okay at an airport before I was sure
Yeah,
what was
well,
what.
no,
We confirmed it when
you
I got
said
back home.
you would
Yeah,
check.
I checked.
and
yeah.
you went along with it. I'm not exactly sure why I picked them, except that I want to ask you, for people who are new to Baraka,
Mhm.
what do these poems say about this middle period?
Well, again, it's sort of the early moving into the middle.
In what way could this be an introduction to a Baraka that people should carry with them when they encounter other Baraka?
Well, you're seeing, as the title of what documentary about him has it, you're seeing a poet in motion. And that comes across very clearly in both of these poems. You're also seeing someone who's so deeply embedded in music, it's like coming out of his ears. Again, we know from the autobiography that as a teenager he was trying to play trumpet in the school band. He wasn't that much of a trumpet player, and I don't think he ever tried again in life. But you know, music was such a tight part of him. And in that triad of Baraka, the poet, Bob Thompson, the painter, Elvin Jones, the musician, you kind of see a lot of what is Baraka's life right there.
Yeah.
I still think probably for someone who doesn't know anything about Baraka, the first book might be the first place to start, because it's a little bit easier to find your way into this later style. The very late Marxist poems are sometimes much more direct. I mean, a lot of them are just agitprop poems, but he's still writing these intense projecting
You said
lyrics.
agitprop.
Yeah, but to the very end, he's still writing these. And you know, in this book, for example, there's some poems about Amina towards the end of the book that are just the most intensely lyrical things that you can imagine. And that's not what people remember, because what they remember about Baraka is the screaming communist guy of the poetry reading, right?
Right.
But these two poems, I think, you know, they capture someone who's in motion and doesn't quite know what to think of it himself, and finds beautiful lyric possibility in that. And they're devoid of the vile, horrible stuff that we find in so many of the poems from 66 to 70 or so.
Right.
Yeah.
All right, one last. I can't resist one last
It's going to be a
question.
stumper?
No,
we got to
it's
call
not.
Billy Joe on the phone.
It's not. Reference to Billy Joe Harris, who knows a lot about Baraka and is in some of these videos. All right. Many of the people watching this video will be making a move from a lot of modernist poems of the teens and 20s and trying to understand what the post-war poets felt about modernism. Return of the Native brings up the issue of modernism. We've talked about it, but I'd love for you to summarize Baraka's... We know the relationship of Baraka to Olson and Creeley, who in some ways are inheritors of modernism, or at least, you know, Olson had a lot to do with the way Ezra Poundian ideas carry forward and so forth. But going back earlier, what is Baraka's relationship to modernism?
Well, again, if you read The System of Dante's Hell or the autobiography, you get a reading list of what he was going through from junior high on.
And the system is very modernist.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah.
And they're full of references to Eliot and Joyce. You know, all the people that we all read when we're starting out, as it were.
Right.
And then the question is, you know, what do you do with that? And as I said, he thought System of Dante's Hell was partly a way of writing himself into himself and not being quite so much Creeley and Olson.
Right.
But what he does is a little different. You know, Olson, in his version of the postmodern, is trying to escape the anthropocentrism that he still finds so strongly in modernism. And of course, the thing that's so hilarious to those of us who read these people is he talks about, you know, the problem with Olson and even Williams is it's still driven through by the beak of the ego. Well, who had more of an ego than Olson or Baraka, right?
Yeah.
But, you know, in all of these instances, you see, as so many African-American writers had to wrestle with this, you can't read the moderns without being slapped in the face with racism at every turn. You know, you're hard-pressed to point to too many well-known modernist poets where that's not a problem.
Right.
It wasn't a problem for all modern poets, but the ones for whom it wasn't a problem aren't so well known all the time.
Interestingly.
Yeah. And well, they also weren't quite as disruptive in their poetics as a Gertrude Stein or even a Williams, for example. But, you know, if this is the stuff on which you cut your teeth, what do you do next?
Yes,
right?
good.
Well, one thing you do is you go back to the, you know, it's like Pound in the first canto going back to Homer, and then going through Dante and so forth. You know, Baraka goes to Dante, but he revises the hell. He moves the hypocrites to a different spot in hell.
Right.
So he's literally rewriting the origins of a certain mode of epic thought.
Interesting.
And he's hoping to do, even before he becomes a nationalist, he's trying to do that same kind of thing, which again is part of the large project of the New American Poetry. What do we do in our time? But then he rebels against that, of course.
Right.
And many people have noticed that for many of the writers of the black aesthetic looks an awful lot like a modernist poetic aesthetic. And the mistake people make is then saying, well, that was a white aesthetic. Even Baraka would say something like that in the mid-'60s. But again, if you go back and look at what's happening, there's a reason that it's called the Jazz Age, for God's sake.
That's right.
And like I said, if you go back and read C.L.R. James and Black Jacobins, W.B. Du Bois in a book like Black Reconstruction, you see this conception of modernity itself having as a condition of its possibility the black diaspora and the slave trade. And then it's a very short step from that to seeing the ways the black artists in all the different arts were not just people who saw modernism and jumped on the train, but were people who helped get the train going in the first place. And so we see, it's important to see, one of the problems of Baraka being the only black poet in the New American Poetry, and we can point to other places where we see the same kind of phenomenon, is that people tend to think of these black poets as being guys that were kind of there with the beats.
That's right.
As opposed to being, anyone who's read the beats know how much black culture meant to those guys.
Right.
So we have to understand, black artists as being people who led into the beat movement, weren't just part hangers-on or something like that.
Yeah.
Now again, the cover of this book sends a pretty clear message, but it's the ironies of America. It's a message designed by white people.
Yeah, it's pretty striking.
What do you make of that?
Yeah. Aldon Nielsen, thank you so much.
Thank you.
This was really great.
Yeah, always enjoy coming to Kelly Writer's house.
Yeah.